Hello, this is the second part of your How to Read a Text Like a Writer video. For some reason, Screencastify turned off halfway through, so we're going to go ahead and finish this up, and then you'll have two videos you have to watch. You can watch. All right, so let's get back to our text. So here we read about my aunt crawled out of the wreck, face full of blood, and sat on the roadside. This right here, face full, an example of alliteration. It's kind of a writing technique to really capture your attention, to get your eyes drawn to that by starting words with the same first letter. So faceful, and then of blood, another F sound in there. So really kind of draws your attention. Her husband had been thrown out of the pickup and lay completely still in the middle of the road. Dead, knocked out, passed out, my aunt asked herself. You know what I'm curious about? When it says asked herself, I wonder, did she do this out loud or silently? I tend to think it was out loud because of the quotation marks, but I'm not really sure. So it's kind of something interesting. After a while, again, the way that Alexi uses phrases at the beginning of paragraphs and sentences to move time forward. So sometime after the accident, another car arrived and stopped. They wrapped an old shirt around my aunt's head and loaded her husband into the back seat. Is he dead? My aunt asked. Nah, he'll be all right. Interesting that we've got dialogue, but we don't know who says this, right? Clearly, it's got to be whoever this they is that stopped. There were more than one person in the car, but Alexi doesn't find them important enough to include names or descriptions, or even it was two men, it was two women, it was a couple, it was a family. We don't know. They are clearly not important to the story. My aunt and her husband are the two people we should be focused on as readers. So, okay. They drove that way to the hospital. My aunt bled into the shirt. Her husband slept through his concussion. They kept him overnight for observation, and my aunt slept on a cot beside his bed. She left the television on with the volume turned off. There's some really interesting use of parallelism that Alexi does here. So especially in this first sentence, we know it is a compound sentence because there's a semicolon there. So you've got one complete sentence and another. The use of a semicolon tells us as readers that those two ideas go together. They're related to one another. So it's there are two complete thoughts, but they're related. They're familiar with one another. And then, so let's take a look at this. My aunt, which is the subject of this sentence, her husband is the subject of that sentence. Our action or verb is bled. And in this one, the action or verb follows right after it, slept. And then it's followed by a prepositional phrase starting with into, that's a preposition. And here we've got another prepositional phrase with through as our preposition. So that's an example of parallelism, where you would write two sentences right next to one another that have the same pattern. Subject, in this case, it's subject, verb, prepositional phrase. So really interesting use of writing. And again, we've got they kept him overnight for observation, comma, and that makes it another compound sentence. So we have two compound sentences in a row. This one uses a semicolon. That one uses comma and the word and. But again, we've got they is our subject, my aunt, Kept is our verb. Slept. Overnight, that is an adverb. It tells us the time frame. And then for observation is our prepositional phrase. Whereas over here, we've got two prepositional phrases. On a cot, beside his bed. So not exactly the same pattern, but again, we've got two compound sentences, one right after the other. She left the television on with the volume turned off. And as I pointed out in the reader one, you've got this contrast here. The TV's on, so there's images. The volume is off, so there's no sound. Why would Alexi do that? I mean, it's really interesting to create an image in our mind. You've got this bloody shirt, husband's asleep, he's in the hospital bed, aunt is sleeping on the cot. There's all these images, all this activity, but it's silent. It's interesting the way Alexi put that together. And again, at sunrise, Alexi is moving time forward, doesn't give us a time, just doesn't go into too much details, just like, okay, now it's sunrise. My aunt shook her husband awake. What? He asked, completely surprised. Where am I? Did you notice this is the first time he speaks? This whole story up to this point, it's all been nonverbal communication. He smiles, he steps on the gas, he dances. He hasn't said anything. Now he's in the hospital. The first thing he says is, what? Where am I? In the hospital. Again? Yeah, again. 30 years later, and they still hadn't paid the bill for services rendered. This little bit right here tells us so much using so few words. So you've got Alexi using dialogue, but using very few words in this dialogue to communicate so much. So there's only 6 words there. But in that dialogue, we learn that this has happened before. Right? So is there a pattern? Is the uncle an alcoholic? He's like, oh, I'm here again. And aunt is like, yeah, again. Okay. So, and it also makes me wonder, will it happen again? He's in the hospital again. She's confirming it, but is there a pattern starting to emerge? So it's really interesting how Alexi uses this dialogue with the uncle, or not the uncle, the husband, and doesn't use a lot of words, but is able to communicate a lot through very few words. And then 30 years later, he takes us back. He reminds us once again, hey guys, this is a flashback, right? This happened 30 years ago. And in those 30 years, they haven't they haven't paid for the bill yet. So kind of tells you, again, more about